Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us on News at Prime. Now, the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence has been interviewing the 10 shortlisted candidates for the position of Inspector General of Intelligence this week. The term of the current Inspector General of Intelligence, Sitlo Mamaru Isaac Dintwe, comes to an end next month. To talk more on this, we're joined by Professor Jane Duncan from the Department of Journalism at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Duncan, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. The search for South Africa's next Inspector General of Intelligence started on Tuesday. It's ongoing, and of course the candidates have been grilled. But before we get into the crux of some of those heated questions, let's talk about the role of this position and why it's so important.
Good evening, Paul. Good evening to your viewers. The Inspector General for Intelligence is extremely important in terms of intelligence oversight, because the Inspector General has powers that no other entity in the country has. They have full sight of all intelligence documents and can inquire into a range of issues relating to abuses and malfeasance in the intelligence services in a way that the Joint Standing Committee can't, because the Joint Standing Committee is precluded by law from inquiring into the identities of operatives, including in situations where there have been abuses. So effectively, the Inspector General has a monitoring function and a review function based on what they monitor. It's a complaints receiving body from members of the public and also members of the services. And on an annual basis, it issues certificates to the services about their compliance with the Constitution and with the law and policy. And part of that certification process is based on reports that the Directors General of the various services actually send to the Inspector General. It's quite a thorough, comprehensive process.
Yes, and in its thoroughness, we've seen the caliber of questions that have been posed to the candidates really being grilled, and some very dirty laundry was inevitably hung when some questions were posed to some of the candidates. We heard topics like cybersecurity, monitoring of intelligence agencies, and some of the challenges that candidates were asked to point out included looking into the Oversight Act and scrutinizing it to allow some form of independence. What did you make of some of those responses and perhaps that major challenge of the Oversight Act?
I think some very important issues around the Oversight Act were aired in the hearings. The Inspector General, in spite of its centrality to oversight generally, lacks independence and resources. But perhaps the most fundamental problem, which came up time and again in the interviews and also in the Zondo Commission, when the Inspector General, Sitlo Mamaru Dintwe, was testifying, was that the office lacks remedial powers in the way that the public protector has remedial powers. And what that means was graphically demonstrated in the latest JSCI annual report, where they revealed that between 98 and 100% of the recommendations that are made by the Inspector General's office are ignored by the intelligence services precisely because they have the status of recommendations and the Inspector General has no enforcement powers. But the problem doesn't stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also trying to make sense of perhaps the functionalities and how the role of the Inspector General should be handled when it comes to the executive being allowed muscle to interfere, also points to some consideration on amending the Oversight Act.
Definitely, yes. And some of the amendments that I think need to be considered and that were canvassed during the hearings is over and above the Inspector General having remedial powers. It's perverse for the Inspector General's office to be a spending center of one of the very agencies that it oversees, the State Security Agency, which administers its budget and ring-fences its budget. the Inspector General's office is dependent on the State Security Agency's IT systems. So what that means is that while the Inspector General cannot access the SSA's documents directly, the SSA can access the Inspector General's documents directly, including documents potentially relating to investigations about the SSA. The Inspector General's office doesn't have appointment powers over its own staff. The Minister of Intelligence, and I would assume now the Ministry in the Presidency, has the powers of appointment. And this has led to a situation where previous ministers that perhaps didn't have the best interests of the country at heart managed to throttle the Inspector General's functioning by failing to appoint adequate numbers of staff. So it's these kinds of issues that I think need to be addressed going forward, because in reality, we're talking about a spy watchdog that has many, if not most, of its teeth missing.
Absolutely. You make mention of the dependence of on the IT systems, but we know that the entire budget falls within the State Security Agency, which is also another concerning factor.
Yes, and the problems don't end there, because in spite of the fact that in terms of the Act, the intelligence agencies it oversees are not allowed to withhold information from the Inspector General. In reality, they frustrate the functioning of that office by delaying providing access to documents. Now, if we contrast that with how the Inspector General for Intelligence and Security operates in Australia, there's none of this, please can we have documents. If the Inspector General wants a document, they have direct unmediated access to the documents of the agencies they oversee, and they just get into their servers and pull the documents out. It's those kinds of innovations that we should be considering.
We know that throughout the interview process, the issue of a cybersecurity vision also came to the forefront, especially as the questions were posed to candidate Smanga Jele. And it was then uncovered that there is no solid vision on how cybersecurity should be viewed and tackled, which points to some concerns.
Yes, it does. And this is actually a long-standing problem in the country, because there was a cybersecurity strategy and there was a dedicated body, in fact, within the State Security Agency that dealt with cybersecurity matters. Much of that has been dismantled. And I think because of that, we are vulnerable as a country to cyber attacks. So it's those kinds of problems that I think need to be addressed going forward.
And in terms of, very lastly, the candidates that came to the forefront, I mean, the questions were really quite hard-hitting. And I remember at one point, one of the people who were asking the questions were talking about perhaps recycling, saying that it will be concerning if you need to recycle candidates because a lot of them are in the system, but not showing how much of an impact they can make in terms of fulfilling this role.
I think that's a very apposite observation. I think if we look at the majority of candidates, they either come from the Inspector General's office or they come or have come from the services. And given the state of intelligence in the past couple of years, I suspect it may be better for us to err on the side of new brooms that can sweep clean, even if those new brooms don't necessarily have the level of knowledge and experience that other candidates have. That knowledge and experience can be built, but I think a fresh approach will prevent us from lapsing into the kind of inertia that we've seen falling over the intelligence community, including the Inspector General's office.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time and weighing in on this matter. That was Professor Jane Duncan from the Department of Journalism at the University of Johannesburg, speaking to the Joint Standing Committee of Intelligence, interviewing some candidates for this very important role.